Thank you, Holly, for the invitation. It's a real privilege to be able to share my work, but it's an even greater privilege to be able to share other people's work and to learn about it. I'm going to read my presentation because I've got an awful lot to get through, and time is short. I'm going to present 4 strands of creative work that are all deep engagements with the past, be that of landscapes, their inhabitants, or of institutions and their legacies. Over 40 years ago, while living in the west of Ireland, I began to work with stone, which is working with deep geological time. The work sometimes involved mending a farmer's wall that blended indistinguishably with that of a prehistoric fort, or the rebuild of a ruined cottage, each an engagement with, or a disturbance of, the echo of past lives. I grew skilled at the work. Walls grew into habitable sculptures. This work, Tearman na Githa, is a favourite. Made in 1993 as part of Tír Soile Symposium in Mayo, it was inspired by the monastic cells of the early Christian hermits. It stands on the edge of a cliff near Kilcommon above a great storm beach and an ever-restless ocean. This is an image of another dry stone cell or prayer house, the shelter of the bay in West Cork. It was a goal in the creation of these works to present a place of shelter, a contemplative space within unforgiving landscapes on an edge of the world. The same desire surely informed similar building over 1,200 years ago. Life led further west. This image shows a detail of a work made in Central California, where I lived for 20 years, and where work as a full-time artist began. During that time, I was invited to create a permanent installation to celebrate the ghosts of this landscape. Those ghosts would most likely have been of the indigenous people, the Costanoan Ohlone Indians, but I knew nothing about these people. It was as though they had almost completely disappeared from contemporary discourse in California, leaving no physical marks or cultural legacy behind them. Occasionally their burial grounds would be disturbed during the construction of a new shopping mall or the like, and the scattered remnants of the communities would be briefly discussed. I became interested in the history of these people, their heritage, and their relationship to place, one that was greatly complicated by their loss of language and of place names, those precious links to the landscape, their ritual sites, and their cultural history. In the year 2000, I was awarded a large public commission by the city of San Jose in commemoration, not celebration, of the Costanoan Ohlone, and in the process I learned a great deal more about them. What was their heritage? Well, there was no unity of voice among those who claimed it as their own. Some sought to express and revive their culture through traditions such as foraging and basket making, others through song and dance, even though their language was virtually lost and their dance steps were reinventions. Others showed less interest in past traditions, but more in the present goal of gaining federal recognition and any funding streams which might follow. Common to all was a clear and understandable memory of hurt and dislocation, and the certain knowledge that without their heritage, fictive though some of it might be, they had no sense of identity in their society or the world. I found this profoundly affecting and was reminded that all communities and all people are works of the imagination. The extensive research for the work informed its creation. It is made of Kilkenny limestone. The pattern within the pavement is based on the spiral weave of a traditional Ohlone basket. These baskets are one of the few types of cultural artefacts that remain of the Ohlone's historical presence in the world. Texts from old mission records and wax cylinder recordings were blasted onto stone bands that radiate from the spiral. These connect at one end to a large gift or feasting basket, often woven over years to such dimensions. At the far end is a giant broken mortar bowl. Traditionally, upon the death of its owner, her mortar bowl was broken. While this mortar suggests a cultural reality, the spiral weave of the pavement basket also suggests a process of becoming, one where the strands of a people's heritage are being rewoven into a new expression. I should add that the irony was lost on few that a non-Indian was selected to create this work, but that is another, if altogether, familiar story. In the year 2000, my wife and I returned to live in Ireland. Ours was a strange society then, and in many ways still is. Everything, including landscape and cultural heritage, has become branded and monetised. Last week, a radio advert mentioned the €65 million Giant's Causeway. What does that mean? There was a strong desire to avoid such madness, to root in different soil. One day, while walking, I decided to initiate a process where the everyday of our locality and the history of its landscape would become the subject of creative practice, where living creatively among our neighbours might find expression in artistic work. So started the Townlands project. This is the landscape of North Kilkenny in which we live. Walking the dogs among these fields, I learned that each one had a name. As they were rapidly being consolidated, the fields, not the dogs, into larger pasture blocks, many of those some centuries old would disappear, and with them what they hold. Tim Robinson has well described place names as an interlock between language and landscape, perhaps too between the dead and the living. It is everywhere now being broken. I set about recording them. Also begun was a photo documentary of the parish landmarks, of work practices, of ongoing changes to vernacular culture, to daily rhythms and processions. My wife Gypsy also participated in the process, creating a wonderful series of drawings in our neighbours' barns. Knowing that many of our neighbours would not comfortably visit an art gallery, the first presentation of the fruits of our work was within the local community hall during Kilkenny Arts Festival in 2009. Now that was a challenging space. Leaving the hall in complete darkness, we created small white cube galleries using inverted election posters, created installations and projected images. As the work is ongoing, albeit at its own pace, there have over the years been several exhibitions in more conventional gallery spaces. I should state here that a request for financial support of this work and its exhibition was made to the Heritage Council, who advised that as it was at heart an art project, they were not an appropriate funding source and had considerably less funds to distribute to a much greater demand. That's true. A formal application subsequently made to the Arts Council proved unsuccessful. This perception of art and heritage as separate territories is a constant challenge. However, Dervla Ledwidge, the Heritage Officer for Kilkenny County Council, was very supportive of the project, as was Mary Butler, the Arts Officer. With their support, Barnstorm Theatre Company were invited to engage with staff and students at our local village school and to develop a play based on material from the Folklore Commission's 1938 Schools Initiative, so that some of the pupils were devising and acting in plays based on local history recorded by their grandparents in that same school 80 years previously. We took portraits of every child in the school and of a great many adults too, audio recording their local histories, so that they might be included in a beautiful publication of which I have a display copy here. It is a synthesis of art and heritage and the project's most tangible legacy. The contributors included the historical geographer Paddy Duffy, poets Kerry Hardy and Cormac Cummins, writer Dervla Murphy, my wife, the artist Gypsy Ray, and myself. The publication was supported by the Heritage Council. Another outgrowth of this engagement with the local is the Kilkenny Field Name Recording Project, which has grown out of my initial walks through the fields of our neighbours, and I'm privileged to be still facilitating this work. Engagement is now county-wide with over 100 volunteers, 8,000 field and place names gathered, with much local history besides. There have been exhibitions, publications, of which this is the last, and a series of short films made with the support of Creative Ireland. This is another long-term art and heritage project. However, it deals with a heritage of which we should not be proud. In 2011, a documentary by the late Mary Raftery was aired on national television. Behind the Walls was an investigation of the history of institutional care for the mentally ill in Ireland. In the course of the programme, we learned that the records of St Brendan's Hospital, Grangegorman, and belongings of past patients had been discovered and retrieved by volunteers in an old attic within the hospital. In 2012, I contacted RTE to learn what had happened to those belongings, and they put me in touch with the contact of the National Archives, who put me in touch with retired hospital staff, all of whom were enthusiastic supporters of my desire to shine further light on this material and to make art from it. I'll play a short film clip that explains my approach. Personal effects. A project and a process in development. The process is an exploration of personal effects, of persons, of institutions, and of their effects. St Brendan's Hospital, Grangegorman, founded in 1815 as the Richmond Asylum, with a population at its height of 2,000 patients and 2,000 staff, was a town within a city. Many of its buildings are abandoned now, no longer fit for purpose, neglected. But recently, found in its gaping attics, a treasure trove of archives, the most complete in Ireland. An almost manic record of the hospital and of its patients for almost 2 centuries. Here too were found boxes and boxes of personal effects, a strange word for the precious things of other lives. Purses, handbags, diaries, letters, treasures from home. Patients' belongings were taken away on admission and only returned if they became known to themselves again or were discharged. These are the belongings of dead or discharged patients. No claim was ever made for them. Here, the cherished cutlery set, the memory of the table. Here, the keys to home, to the bright old door, to chains and to locks that never, ever opened again. Here, heaps of rosary beads, threads to another world, and the longed-for promise of a warm welcome, and the healing of the broken. Within this trove are more than personal histories, for secreted within these belongings and the hospital records is a social history of Ireland, of who we are as a people and as persons. These lives are of our tribe. They are one with us, and like us, they had rich, rich inner lives. Like you and I, they dreamed of other places, of other ways of being in the world. Like you and I, they had their doubts and their vanities, their secrets and their cherished memories, their great plans and their magnificent schemes, their poetry and their dignity. I have no wish to disturb these privacies, although they have awakened my own, along with memories of these buildings as a child. As an artist, I feel compelled to respond to this memorabilia and to the hospital's archive, to draw these histories up from the darkness so that we might recognize them as our own. Thank you. Time was spent in the National Archives researching the records. Their level of detail was stunning, suggestive that the systems of the institution and their organisation took priority over the patients in its care. In a dilapidated ward scheduled for demolition were stored chaotic piles of papers related to institutional management, but also containing correspondence to patients from relatives. Among the boxes of handbags were photographs, cards, personal memorabilia. There was poignant correspondence, such as this from a young woman in a mother and baby home to a patient in the hospital. They were having a child. There were notices such as this one registering the committal of a 17-year-old girl to the hospital from a Magdalen laundry where she was understandably resistant to authority. This in 1968. A selection was made of this material and it was recorded by actors in a studio as the basis for an exhibition soundtrack. I began to photo document the work and to make selective compositions. Of course, I had to have permission to access this material, which I managed to carefully negotiate and for which I am deeply grateful to the HSE. Guided by that organisation's dictum that the right to privacy does not die with the patient, I had to remove all possibilities of identification. This was an especially challenging process in the case of photographs, and I don't mean that in the technical sense. There was a sense that I was continuing a perverse process of erasing the individual. But for what and for whom? Consider this. Your personal belongings and mementos, your personal heritage, such as this photograph, were removed from you upon entry to the institution, and then withheld from you in the course of your perhaps lifelong stay, ostensibly for safekeeping. Such was the everyday cruelty of the system. It is a constant thread in our social history, from the workhouses of the mid-19th century to the direct provision asylum centres of today. This is very, very briefly. This is the exhibition. Handbags hanging in darkness, internally lit, the objects falling in suspense, the soundtrack of the actors reading from the material that I'd found in the ward. Access, Ballymun were wonderful. Financial support for this project was very, very difficult to receive. The Arts Council did not support it. I received a great deal of pro bono support from institutions like Access, and the Health Service Executive stepped in when I actually started to put out the exhibitions and covered the costs. This is in an extension of the exhibition in St. Canice's. The addition here is that you have medicine cabinets. You look at yourself, you open it, you see a story of an erased individual with an object. You create the story, whether it was allowed to flower or not. There were reading rooms with patients' testimonies. What I'd like to do now, very briefly, is just to finish out this last less than 2 minutes. It is, I made a radio documentary with Doc on One about this project. Like the book on the Townlands project, this is the lasting legacy of the work, and you can hear it on the podcast. I spent a great deal of time in Glasnevin Cemetery. We're now in Glasnevin Cemetery, and somewhere among all these headstones are the bodies of the patients from Grangegorman, and we hope to find them. My name is Alan. I spoke to you on Friday.
Yes.
I'm the man doing the research on Grangegorman.
Oh,
Lynn Brady, genealogist at the Glasnevin Trust, trawled through the cemetery's archive and was able to provide a number of burials of patients from the institution.
Were they buried in a particular plot?
Later, not necessarily. No, they're actually buried all over the cemetery.
As they came in paupers' graves?
Yeah.
Between 1859 and 1928, the bodies of 2,491 patients, unclaimed by family or relatives, were sent from the Richmond Asylum to Glasnevin Cemetery.
Some of the graves are so ornate. When you're looking for an unmarked grave, you're just looking at an area of open ground in which somebody may lie, or probably does lie.
Between 1928 and 1957, the bodies of 410 patients, unclaimed by family or relatives, were sent to Glasnevin Cemetery for burial.
It does seem impossible that among all these headstones that there would be room for so many paupers' graves. That could be an unmarked grave. Any piece of ground that does not have a stone marker on it.
The last burial at Glasnevin from the hospital was in the year 2000. Between 1957 and that year, the newly named St Brendan's Hospital sent 175 bodies for burial. That's a sum of 3,076 people in 140 years.
22 of those bodies, likely the most recent, are buried within a plot marked by a stone for St Brendan's Hospital. All others are scattered in unmarked paupers' graves throughout the cemetery, as beyond reach now as they were during their lives.
Glasnevin Cemetery. Grave.
N17 South.
Name.
Anne B.
Occupation.
Servant.
Address.
Richmond Lunatic Asylum.
Cause of death.
Fatty heart.
Age.
69.
I'm going to stop there. There's the last question for you. Thank you very much.